Thank you so much for joining us for another Dispatch from the Front Lines. This is an ongoing series from the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. Each week we hear from people whose lives have been upended by the pandemic, from our movement partners, from congressional champions fighting for policy solutions that help our families and communities. I'm Alan Barber, the Policy Director at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. We are a nonprofit organization that works to inform the public about policies that help promote justice, equity, and fairness. Right now, the nation is in the middle of dueling pandemics: police violence against Black and brown people and the coronavirus. And this has exposed, more so than ever perhaps, the systemic racism embedded throughout our institutions, all the way from healthcare to the voting booth. As voters sought to make their voices heard in Wisconsin and Georgia weeks ago, and in Kentucky just yesterday, we saw blatant and unacceptable voter suppression in cities and counties with large communities of color. Fewer than 200 polling locations of the usual 3,700 were open in Kentucky yesterday. There was only one open in Jefferson County for over 600,000 eligible voters. And of course, Jefferson County is home to the largest concentration of Black voters in the state of Kentucky. As the polls at the Expo Center prepared to close around 6 p.m. last night, I was absolutely shook to see videos of hundreds of voters locked out of that polling station until a last-minute injunction allowed voting to continue to 6:30. That was only for those on the fairgrounds, even though the line stretched well into the parking lot. Hours-long lines like this, mail-in ballots that never reach the mailbox, and polling locations far from work and home are just some of the barriers that voters have been facing as of late. But we also know that voter disenfranchisement is not new to this election year or this pandemic, and it's always targeted Black, brown, and poor communities the most. No one should have to wait hours to cast their ballot, but especially not during a healthcare crisis. The coronavirus pandemic has forced many to choose between risking their health at the polls and risking the health of a nation in which voting seems more like an obstacle course than an essential right. The stakes are far too high for far too many of us for us to allow these attacks on our democracy to continue. As Representative Marcia Fudge reminds us, if you are not encouraging the vote, you are suppressing it. Now, before we begin tonight's discussion about voting, I'm thrilled to introduce Juliana Macedo do Nascimento, who is the state and local policy manager at United We Dream and a DACA recipient, who's going to give us an update on the Supreme Court's recent decision last week. Juliana, United We Dream members took the fight to protect DACA all the way to the Supreme Court. Last Thursday, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration's decision to cancel the program was arbitrary and capricious. Can you give us a quick overview of what this ruling means and what happens next, and how folks can support your work?
Yes. Hi, Alan. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. As you said, last week, the Supreme Court gave us a big win, right? The DACA case had been going through the courts for 2 years now since the end of the termination of it in 2017. And we finally got our win. We finally got the decision. And what it means is that for now, DACA stays, right? We want to celebrate that. But we also know that the decision is only a temporary fix, just like DACA was always a temporary fix, right? And we know that this administration has already talked about writing a second memo to terminate it yet again. So we know, while we want to celebrate our victory, we know that this is just to give us a little bit of a breathing room, right? To recenter and refocus ourselves, to fight for a more permanent solution. And something like the Dream and Promise Act, right? HR 6 that has passed the House just last year. If the Senate were to pick it up, we wouldn't complain about it, right? Because it's a really good example of a policy that helps people without hurting people. Right? What we like about it is that it gives citizenship or pathway to citizenship for not only DACA recipients, but also TPS and DED folks. without any money for enforcement, right? We've already compromised enough on immigration, and now we feel like any policy that will throw the rest of our communities and our own families under the bus, frankly, is just not good enough. And Dream and Promises Act really lives up to that, right? The second thing that we want to do right now is just be in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters in the struggle for Black lives, right? Black immigrants are disproportionately targeted and deported by immigration enforcement. And we stand with them and other Black people because our struggles are really tied together. And we really believe that at United We Dream, right? But as far as how can folks support our work, we would love if folks would join us. Text 877-877 DACA decision to that number. So text DACA decision to 877-877 or visit our website, dacadecision.com. There's plenty of information there. We are putting out we just put out a good FAQ explaining to folks about first-time applications, which USCIS hasn't put out any guidance on yet, right, on how they're going to resume receiving and processing those applications. So we're waiting on DHS and USCIS to follow the court's order and start receiving those applications again. But until then, if folks can stay tuned in and updated, that would be really great. And the other way that they can help is just, being solidarity again with the movement for Black lives. We are out there with our folks. We know that ICE and CBP is patrolling those protests as well, but we really hope that everybody is doing their part where they can.
Thank you so much, Juliana. And for the folks who are watching, a lot of the information that Juliana just shared with us will be dropped into the chat of this dispatch. And again, I believe that Juliana, you were saying text DACA decision to 8787 for more
877-877. So two sevens there.
27. Sorry about that. Thanks for correcting me.
Yeah, thank you.
We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today, and we hope that we can talk more about DACA and the immigrant rights movement soon.
Thank you so much.
Tonight, we're lucky to be joined by an incredible group of activists, policy analysts, and a member of Congress who have been fighting for voting rights since long before the coronavirus, including Representative Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts, Leigh Chapman from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, LaTosha Brown from Black Voters Matter Fund, Ufot from the New Georgia Project, and Shuff from DC Vote. We're going to begin tonight with Representative Kennedy. I'm so honored to introduce our congressional guest speaker for the evening, Congressman Joe Kennedy. Representative Kennedy represents the 4th District of Massachusetts in Congress and serves on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. He is a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the Congressional Voting Rights Caucus, and a longtime advocate for protecting and expanding our right to vote. He's pushed for a statewide vote-at-home law in his home state, as well as urging Congress to allocate funding for similar reforms across the country for the 2020 primary and the general elections. Let's start by talking about keeping our democracy safe in the midst of this pandemic. The CARES Act provided $400 million for election administration grants to help states to prevent, prepare, and respond to coronavirus for the 2020 federal election cycle. But that wasn't nearly enough. The HEROES Act, which has passed the House but has not been voted on in the Senate, includes provisions that would guarantee vote at home for the November 2020 elections and all future elections. It also ensures that people can register to vote by mail or online, and requires states to create safety contingency plans to enable voting in federal elections during a public health or national emergency. As we're seeing new spikes in coronavirus cases nationwide, what more can lawmakers do to ensure that we have safe and fair elections during this pandemic and beyond?
Alan, thank you. Thank you for the question. I am really honored and thrilled to join this incredible group of panelists up here to talk about an issue that is literally the foundation of our democracy. And so the short answer to what else can we do is a lot. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. And so we can start literally with HR 1, which was the first bill that a Democratic-led House of Representatives actually moved through that actually contained language to try to strengthen voting rights in response to the Supreme Court decision, Shelby v. Alabama, to actually try to codify and protect those rights, and additional rollbacks that we've seen from conservatives in office. The next thing I think we have to do is recognize that at the core of protecting the right to vote is meeting people where they are. And that means understanding that depending on the locations that you're talking about, the constituencies that we're focused on, it means understanding that one, not everybody's going to have obviously access to a car or even access to public transit. There's folks out there that have a right to vote that are going to be struggling with disabilities, that perhaps can't take prolonged time off from work, that are hourly wage earners, they can't wait from work for hours at a time, that maybe you've got kids at home and you can't leave them for a long time, that we essentially have to craft policies that recognize the diverse circumstances that our electorate is confronting, and then says, okay, understanding that, what is it that you need in order to make sure that you can actually get to vote? And so vote at home, vote by mail is a critically important piece to this, but not everybody is comfortable voting by mail. Not everybody checks their mail. Not everybody, you get some random piece of mail, people might miss it. That's a big deal. So there's the initial question of how do we do things like vote by mail, automatic voter registration, same day voter registration. How do we continue to put in place policies that push back against the need for voting ID cards in Texas, where a firearms ID card counts as valid identification, but a student ID doesn't? All of these myriad ways in which voting rights are attacked. And then the last piece here, we actually have to put money behind them as well, right? So it's not enough to say, hey, people might be able to vote by mail if no one knows that that's actually an option. You have to put money behind a public awareness campaign to actually educate voters about how that process works. We've seen states that actually do this well, where every year it gets better, but there's a lag to that. Well, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We've seen the impact, not just for folks that are immunocompromised and can't go outside, but what happens when you can't find poll workers. And you have Milwaukee, we saw the number of polling locations go from 180 to 5. And so what happens? Because you couldn't find the poll workers. What happens? Drastically long lines. What happens? The people that can vote are folks that can afford to take a day off from work. That's not democracy. So a lot, like I said.
Fair enough, fair enough. Thank you very much for your efforts and leadership on this issue, Congressman. Are there, I know you have some other commitments this evening, but are there any parting thoughts around building up voter rights that you would like to leave us with this evening? So
the last piece on this is something that unfortunately, obviously we shouldn't have to fight for, but we do. And so we were heartened yesterday to see all of, Alan, as you said, to see those people banging on those doors saying, hey, let me in, let my voice be heard. Obviously, in the midst of a pandemic, we shouldn't be forcing people in this country to choose between their health and their vote. But if that is what folks are going to force us to do, then we have to find a way of holding those accountable. And that means that we have to be relentless in this pursuit, and we have to take on those structures from, again, Supreme Court decisions to funding decisions that are continuing to limit super PACs, gerrymandering, that continue to limit people's participation in our democracy. And so this is not going to be solved this election cycle, but we have a chance to actually make those voices heard. And our panelists tonight are going to talk a little bit more about that. But grateful to join you, and thank you for your attention on this critically important topic.
And thank you so much for joining us again and for your leadership here.
Thank you.
We're very grateful for you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, sir. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks. Next, we're going to turn to Leigh Chapman, the Director of Voting Rights Program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Prior to the leadership conference, Leigh was senior policy advisor at Let America Vote. And prior to that, she was the policy director for the Pennsylvania Secretary of State. And she was a staff attorney at the Voter Protection Program at Advancement Project. This week, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is holding a week of action on voting rights. 55 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we still see voter suppression, voter ID laws, and other concerted efforts to limit voting, especially for Black voters and voters of color. Before we hear from some of the other organizers who have experienced recent voter suppression in unsafe and unfair local elections, we want to turn to you, Leigh, to give us an overview of the state of voting rights in America today.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you to the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center for having me here today to discuss how we can protect our democracy in 2020. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is the largest and oldest civil rights coalition with over 220 national organizations working together to build an America as good as its ideals. But I just wanted to start off today by just acknowledging that this is a moment of reckoning in our nation. And it's a moment that calls for the voices of marginalized people to be louder than ever. And voting is not going to magically solve all of our country's issues, but it's a necessary action that we all must take to wield our power. And the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic, the protests over police brutality and state violence against Black Americans, present unique challenges to holding an election. But while these are unprecedented times, states are falling far short of fulfilling their obligation to ensure that every voter can cast a ballot that counts this year. And scenes from the polling place have been pure chaos. There have been lack of social distancing, safety measures. There's been voter confusion due to last-minute polling place consolidations. There have been long lines that last for hours, at least for those voters who could actually afford to wait at all. And in fact, a few weeks ago, voters in Georgia waited in 7-hour lines to cast a ballot amid machine breakdowns, a shortage of poll workers, and ballot problems, putting voters and our democracy at risk. And I know my fellow panelists, Inse and LaTosha, will speak about this tonight. In Wisconsin, during their primary just a few months ago, we saw that over 70 voters contracted COVID-19 on election day. We need to make sure that voters have all options to cast their ballot, including vote by mail and safe in-person voting. And voters should never have to choose between their safety and casting a ballot. I just want to briefly touch on the advocacy that the Leadership Conference has been doing around COVID-19 and elections in recent months, and Representative Kennedy touched on this some. But experts have estimated that states need a total of $4 billion in additional funding to prepare for elections in November to make sure that nationwide we have safe, accessible, and secure elections during this pandemic. As a result of our collective advocacy of civil rights and other groups, over $400 million in funding was appropriated by Congress under the CARES Act. But that falls woefully short of the $4 million that's needed. And in May, the US House of Representatives passed the HEROES Act, which was referenced early by Alan, and now the Senate must act. The HEROES Act would allocate the $3.6 billion in additional urgent and necessary funding to states and mandate that states establish at least 2 weeks of early voting, online voter registration, same-day voter registration, no excuse mail voting upon request, and prepaid postage on mail ballot materials, among other vital protections. But this is something that Representative Kennedy referenced, but I want to make one point about vote by mail. Well, vote by mail is a great option, and it should be easy and accessible for all voters. And it should be a key part of our election response plan. Voters must really have a clear range of options to safely cast their ballots this year. Focusing exclusively on vote by mail could potentially disenfranchise voters of color, Native Americans, people with disabilities, non-English speakers, students, low-income families, and people experiencing homelessness. And as we've seen in recent primary elections, some people just prefer to cast their ballot in person. So election officials need to make sure that they have an adequate number of polling places that are staffed to accommodate the demand for in-person voting this year. And finally, as Alan mentioned, this is a big week of action for the Leadership Conference. And the Leadership Conference is continuing to advocate for the restoration of the Voting Rights Act. Many of the problems we've seen in recent elections could have been prevented if we still had Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act intact. Section 5 was the powerful preclearance provision that required the Department of Justice or a federal court to approve voting changes in jurisdictions with a history of voter discrimination. And tomorrow, June 25th, marks the 7th anniversary of Shelby County versus Holder, and this will be our second presidential election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. The U.S. House of Representatives passed the Voting Rights Advancement Act, or H.R. 4, a transformative bill that would restore and modernize the Voting Rights Act in December, but the Senate has yet to take action, and the bill has been in McConnell's legislative graveyard since December. But if we had the Voting Rights Act in place, or the Voting Rights Advancement Act, I should say, in place, we can prevent voter registration purges that affect hundreds of thousands, if not millions of voters, all because they may have missed an election or two. We can prevent the implementation of photo ID laws that we know disproportionately prevent voters of color and younger voters from casting ballots. We can prevent jurisdictions from reducing the level of language assistance provided to citizens at the polls. We can prevent gerrymandering that dilutes Black and brown votes. We can prevent the elimination of polling places, particularly in communities of color, and we can prevent any additional requirements and documentation, like citizenship paperwork, that many just don't have access to. So I just want to leave you with this. Even in this moment, we all need to remember that our voices have power, our movement is strong, and our fight to dismantle barriers to the ballot is more important than ever. And when voters cast their ballots in November, we will be heard.
Thanks, Leigh. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do to protect voting rights this year. If our viewers are wondering what they can do to protect their own right to vote, or to make sure that everyone's voice can be heard this year, what can they do?
Sure. So, if you're listening to this and you want to get involved, I would say the first thing to do is register to vote. Check your registration, make sure that you're on the rolls, and make sure that your friends and family are registered. Then, of course, vote. Remember that elected officials work for you and you have the power. The third thing I would say is to sign up and join the fight against voter suppression. The Leadership Conference launched a campaign called And Still I Vote. And it's a campaign to really shine a light on voter suppression and mobilize people to take action. And we launched this campaign at the end of February on the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday as we were crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So if you're interested in joining the fight against voter suppression, you can join our website, andstillivote.org, and you can sign petitions. You can contact your Secretary of State to implement many of the reforms that we've been talking about this evening. And with so much at stake right now, I want to just say, everyone, please remember to fill out your census form. Each person who gets counted also builds political power and gives us a fair say in electing our leaders. And finally, as I mentioned, this is the Leadership Conference's National Week of Action. Tomorrow marks the 7th anniversary of the Shelby County versus Holder case, which was the devastating case I mentioned before that opened the floodgates to voter suppression. And at noon tomorrow, we are having a Twitter storm calling on Congress to pass the HEROES Act, which I mentioned, which would give that $3.6 billion of funding to states that's so urgently needed. And we're also calling on the Senate to pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act, H.R. 4. So I hope you can all join us tomorrow for the Twitter storm to protect our democracy. I can't talk. To protect our democracy. It's been a long day, but thank you.
It's been a long week because, I'm sure you've been busy with that week of action. Thank you
Yes,
so much, Leigh.
thank you.
We really appreciate having you join us today. And for everyone who's watching, please check the chats again for links to the different sites and chances for actions that Leigh mentioned in her segment. Next up, we're going to turn to LaTosha Brown. LaTosha Brown is an award-winning Southern organizer, political strategist, thought leader, and vitally, a jazz singer. She's the co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund and the BVM Capacity Building Institute. She is a current resident fellow of Harvard's Institute of Politics, and we are lucky to have her on our board here at the CPC Center. LaTosha, Black Voters Matter Fund is dedicated to increasing voter registration and voter turnout, as well as expanding voter rights and access. Can you tell us what you're seeing on the ground right now?
So thank you for asking. I'm really happy to be here, and I love this panel. And even the conversation has gone so far. Well, the first thing I did right was the day I started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, hold on. And I always sing, because I always want to center this in terms of even my work and in us really understanding that policy alone does not make things happen in this country, right? Even when we look at Brown versus the Board of Education, that was 1954, it was the 1970s before we actually saw many of those schools be desegregated. Part of it's because we also have to make sure that we're changing the public discourse and political will. And so what's really important, I think, is that's why it's really important that when we're talking about voting rights, that we're also making sure that we're engaging citizens in this process so that we've got pressure coming from not just from within Congress, but we also have public pressure that's building behind the support of it. What I am seeing on the ground is I'm seeing just that. Yesterday, I'm literally, probably an hour ago, I just walked in the house, getting right in from Kentucky. And what I saw in Louisville yesterday and what I experienced in Georgia 2 weeks ago and what I experienced in Alabama years ago. I'm a native of Selma, Alabama, and been in a whole lot of voting rights and voting suppression fights and spaces. And what I will say of what I'm seeing different now on the ground is that there is a particular kind of energy and an uprising that I think that people on some level are seeing the fragility of democracy in this country. That on some level, people knew that these systems were not working, but it has been really apparent now, like to the point where you can't even turn your head. It's right in your face. I think that people have been politicized. I think in some interesting ways, Trump has politicized a whole lot of folk around what people can do and what can't do, because some of the stuff that's in place he can do, people can always do that in those positions of power, right? He's just been bold enough and not cared about what was the political backlash. But even that, thinking about how much power that seat holds, is actually ridiculous. Really being able to see this dynamic happen in the States, as we're seeing in Georgia, in the moment where we have witnessed Georgia being the worst as it relates to voter suppression. Here it is that it currently in our state legislature, they are literally considering pushing a bill around not being able to make it illegal to send everybody absentee ballots. So there's a full attack on democracy right now. And so I'm seeing two things. So one, I am seeing, I guess this is C3. Can I be C4?
It's C3.
It's C3. Okay, well, I'll be C3. All right. I will say that there are some very, very bad players in this space that are, and people know who they are. If you're on this call, you know who they are. Who are literally have made, in order to keep their power, that voter suppression has been a strategy and a tool. It's not new. The challenge is this ain't new. It's been going on, and ever since Black folks have been in this country, we've actually had to fight for any kind of sense of our humanity and our dignity and being able to fairly participate in this process. But what it has is it has taken an accelerated turn. And so what we're seeing now is we're actually seeing that as part of the strategy for certain folks and certain parties to stay in power. And I will say this, neither party is completely absolved from this, because I've seen it come from both parties. Let me be honest. One, a little bit more than the other, but let's be honest about what is happening. That what we have also done is we've advocated some of our responsibility around giving our power to political parties instead of the Constitution says we the people, not we the party. And so there's one thing, what I see is that there is this aggressive tactic and strategy to suppress the vote, and it's in a spectrum of ways. On the flip side of what I'm also seeing is I'm seeing people rise up. And it's uncomfortable for some to see, but that's when transformation changed. I often have to remind people who always got something to say about riots that America was formed what was a riot. The Boston Tea Party was considered a riot, y'all. And so my point is, you don't have democracy if you don't have citizens engaged in the shaping of the governance of their country. And so what we've been seeing, what I saw in what gives me hope, what I saw in Louisville, what I've been seeing as we've been going around talking to people, there's a particular people are stirred up. The question is, are we prepared as organizations to literally be able to direct that energy in a way that's going to be transformative? Or are we going to continue with these transactional pieces? Like the way I'm thinking at this point, we're going to have to be honest about even the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a compromise. We operate as if the Voting Rights Act itself was the epitome of what we needed. It was not. It was never far enough. At the time, it was certainly profound because of the environment that it was in, but it's not enough. And so ultimately what has to happen, I think where we can miss the point, is that when you don't connect movement and policy, when people in policy and you don't have that connected, what you will have is you might be able to change a law, right? But one, will it be implemented or enacted? Two, will you just continue to have a fight around it? You've got to change the political wheel. And so I say that because I think it's really important for us to really get the energy of the people right now, that we're actually we're pushing a democracy movement. We need a democracy movement in this country to really be honest about the fragility of democracy and stop saying, well, America is the greatest democracy on earth. No, it's not. Stop it. We need to stop saying that. What we can say is we've got the potential, right, to literally become that. And when the people like literally talk about the possibilities on how we become that, we can build the kind of movement and the kind of energy that we can take advantage of this moment where people are stirred up and are looking for some radical reimagining of this nation.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. And that was a whirlwind tour, and I was there for every moment of it. I just want to know, could you dig in just a little bit more about how once we build that political power, how we sustain that beyond just this 2020 election, how we keep that power, how we really challenge those premises that you mentioned in.
Well, there's a couple of things we got to do that are really going to be different. Like one, we've approached this process as if we're waiting on the next savior to be, we were looking for the best candidate that we could put in office and that's going to change everything, right? That's not true, right? Not only is it not true, it fundamentally doesn't work. We've elected some good folks and saw marginal shifts. We're going to have to do we're going to have to do multiple things. When 50% of the population are not even engaged in the process, that's problematic. So one, we need to do work that we have a more engaged citizenry around this piece. And I do think that this is the moment where people are activated. Two, I think we're also going to have to look at candidates and hold them accountable. The reason why voter suppression continues, y'all, is because there's no accountability. There are no repercussions. Even in Georgia, Brian Kemp stole the election and got a promotion. So we're fundamentally not holding people accountable who are actually still, you might get a bad headlines, but other than that, there's no accountability. In addition to what we're talking about voting rights, we've got to have some measures that literally have some serious repercussions for those that are bad actors in this process. The third thing, what we've got to do is we've got to recreate, like even when we're thinking about kind of party politics. In some ways, I know this is not, this may be a little controversial, but on some level, we have allowed that this whole voting process is about keeping the parties in power. No, this is about people power. Those folks who are in office are supposed to be at the service of us as citizens. And unfortunately, corporate America has taken a particular kind of control over party politics. And we've got to be honest around that so we can actually start unraveling what that means. And then the fourth thing I think that we need is we really need to think about what does the systems. If we're just putting bad people, it's like having a bad computer and putting another user on the computer. The computer's still bad, right? You know, they just might be able to work it a little bit better than the other. But the point is, we do have to reimagine these systems that we have. The fact that we're moving trillions of dollars of money over the internet right now. Most of us probably listening on this call have done Cash App, or with a snap of our fingers, we're moving money, which is one of our most precious resources. Why we can't move votes like that? Why is it so mystical to be able to vote online, but we're moving trillions of dollars? It has nothing to do with the ability or the technology exists. It's about the political will and the education of people to really be able to talk about free and fair access to the ballot. If we moving money, we can move some votes that way. So the bottom line is, part of what we have to do is even stretch ourselves beyond what the systems that exist. I think the other thing that we have to do too is fundamentally, even in the Constitution, it says when government no longer serves its people and serves the interests of people, it should be replaced, reformed, or abolished. The bottom line is we're operating as if there's this thing outside of ourselves, right? And that we're just subjects to it. No, we're supposed to be not a republic. This is supposed to be a democratic government. And so we've got to make it be so. It has not arrived. The idealism of America has not arrived. Why don't we have a voter bill of rights? There should be some protection mechanisms, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats or anybody in power, that literally say that being a voter and a citizen of this country, you have particular rights that are guaranteed, whether that means doing a constitutional amendment or not. My point is, we're not pushing far enough, and we're keep responding to what it seems like a win, and it's not changing. There has to be some major structural change, and some of us have to have the courage to really push for that and really stand in the space to literally get people educated, connected in this moment to really push for those changes.
Thank you so much for that, LaTosha. I really appreciate that. I hope you'll be able to stick around to help field some questions from the stream later on tonight. But next, we're going to be joined by Shirlisa Arnold from Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. Shirlisa is a voter empowerment organizer with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, so she was on the ground in Kentucky last night. The Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is a statewide organization working for a new balance of power and a just society. KFTC uses direct action to challenge and change unfair political, economic, and social systems. Shirlisa, during the primary elections last night, the state used the coronavirus pandemic as an excuse to dramatically cut polling locations, especially in predominantly Black areas. How did those cuts affect the election? Can you tell us what you saw in your community and across the state yesterday?
Thank you so much for that question, Alan, and for you all having me today. So yeah, I've got just a list of like some facts from yesterday, and I think sharing those would be really good to answer the questions. So first off, we experienced, the 60-minute to 2-hour wait times in certain parts of Kentucky. And as you mentioned before, in Louisville, we experienced direct voter suppression by them closing the doors on people waiting in line to vote. I had the pleasure of serving as an election official last year, and I've got a pretty good understanding of what the rules are as an election official, and I know that was against one of them. But I think the biggest thing that negatively affected Black and brown people in Kentucky was the limited polling locations. We were able to do no excuse absentee voting, by mail. But because that request was done so close leading up to the election, a lot of people didn't receive their mail-in ballots until the day of the election, which had to be sent back or postmarked that day. And I think most counties across Kentucky only had one polling place open for people to go vote. I do want to shout out to Pike County because they handled theirs well. There were more than one polling location open there, so the people there had more options. But one thing we saw across the state as well is not only was there limited polling locations, one in each county, but they also made no effort to notify or put signs up at the other polling locations to let people know that there was another one, only one for them to go to. And so that's where KFTC and some other community organizers on the ground, the BG Freedom Walkers here in Bowling Green, we stepped in in making sure that we could notify voters who were coming to their regular polling locations that, you know, many of them have been using for years, would have information on where they're supposed to go vote. And me being at our one polling location, I got to see a lot of young minority Black and brown voters coming in and voting. Some of them, it seemed like, you know, this may have been their first time just because they didn't know exactly where they were going. So it was very nice to see people on the ground doing that work. We also had other community leaders working together to make sure we got rides to the polling location. The way specifically, I'm in Bowling Green, which is Kentucky's third largest city. And the way our one polling place was set up here, it's on the opposite side of town from where most Black and brown people in Bowling Green live. So we had to work with community organizers to make sure we got shuttles and buses going back and forth to offer rides. For people who could have normally walked to their regular polling place, now would have to travel on the opposite side of town, which is about a 20-minute drive. I can't imagine even walking that. So those were just some of the things we saw across the community state. I think the like beautiful outcome of it, which LaTosha kind of spoke on this too in Georgia, but here we had a lot of people, everyday people with their boots on the ground, putting in this work and making sure that people had access to the right to vote. And I just think it's ridiculous that our own government doesn't make sure that everyday people have right to the access to vote. So I'm proud of us regular Kentucky folk that were able to get that done. And we're waiting anxiously for these results, I'll tell you that.
As we all are, and we're all proud of the work that y'all did too. At Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, you did an enormous amount of work to register voters and ensure that voters in Kentucky had the information they needed to vote yesterday. What lessons can we learn from Kentucky across the country for November?
So one big lesson, I think, just a little bit of history. So in our last presidential primary, we only had about 20% of registered voters actually come out. So we're doing rough numbers right now, still taking in measurements, but we were able to check and see that there were 1 million people registered to come out and vote that actually did come out and vote this time. And so seeing that number is just, I think it's a really good marker of the work we put in. One, making sure people were getting registered to vote before the deadline, sharing that information. Also urging our Kentucky government to make it easier for people to do that work online or to have direct contact with their county clerks, especially during the time of this pandemic, to get registered. And KFTC, for I think at least the last 15 years, has been working very hard to get voting rights restored for people with felonies in their past. And having that go into effect at the beginning of this year made a huge difference as well, because we were able to register a whole another slate of voters to make sure that they were able to get out at the polls in time. And I think that's like a really good indicator of who was coming out. It was the people that had been disenfranchised for so long in the state. And I think it's easy for a lot of the rest of the country to pass judgment on Kentucky and what we see come out of Kentucky and go into the Senate. But I think it's when you realize how much is put into suppressing the votes of everyday Kentuckians, you can see how it's possible for certain people to get where they are. And so we were just trying to do some back work and go back over those actions and make sure everyone has that right.
Well, thank you so much, Shirlisa. And I do have to say, after the efforts that you put in last night, I don't think anybody here has a bad idea of what the work that you do and your fellow Kentuckians that you do in Kentucky. Next, we're going to turn to Insay Ufot. Insay is the executive director of the New Georgia Project. She leads the organization with a data-informed approach and a commitment to developing tools that leverage technology with the goal of making it easier for every voter to engage in every election. Insay and her team also developed Georgia's homegrown talent by training and organizing activists across the state. Under Insay's leadership, NGP has registered nearly 400,000 Georgians to vote. Georgia has really been in the center of national events in the last few weeks because of ongoing voter suppression, the climbing COVID-19 cases in the state, and because of the protest over the police murder over Shard Brooks and the vigilante murder of Ahmaud Arbery. I just want to begin by asking how you and your team are doing in this moment,
Well, I'll start by saying this. My team will skewer me if I don't correct you and tell you that we are approaching 450,000 Georgians registered. So I'm going to start with that. Secondly, I mean, it's tough. I think that on the one hand, it is difficult to not feel like we are constantly under attack, right? That, you know, from the president to the governor, sowing seeds of disinformation and putting, you know, wrong information out about not only our democracy, but also, you know, how to stay safe in this moment. It is difficult to not feel as if there are direct attacks from the people who are supposed to be representing us. But what I will also say is that it has strengthened our resolve. It has clarified sort of which side people are on. It has focused the mind. I think that people are absolutely focused on staying alive and focused on taking care of each other and focused on building what we want our communities and our state and our country to look like on the other side of this. I think that everyone in their own way has essentially said that what we have now is not working. And so dispensing with the notion that we are not trying to recapture what we just emerged from, that we aren't trying to go back, is a sort of a unifying thread throughout all of our campaigns and many of the conversations that we're having with each other and that we're having out in the community. And so, you know, I've invested some resources and will continue to do so in making sure that people have someone to talk to, that not only are we physically strong and safe and taking care of ourselves, but that mentally and emotionally, people who do this work regularly in our communities are fortified and have the things that they need in order to show up for themselves and their families and in the communities. But I'll be honest, like there is as much joy and sort of resilience that we are seeing in our campaigns, in our conversations, as there is grief. Because of the loss of loved ones, the loss of community members, and the sort of, again, the realization that no one is coming to save us at all. that the country that we're going to build on the other side of this is going to be built with our labor and built on top of the demands that we have, and period, full stop. You're on mute, Alan.
Sorry, I thought I clicked that.
All good.
I was just saying it heartens me to hear that your team is staying strong and focused and centered through all of this. And I'm really touched by that thread that you hit up on again and again, that we aren't going back after this, that the past is the past, and it's time to center ourselves, capitalize on this power, and move forward towards the country that we imagine and deserve. With that, I want to talk about the recent primary elections in Georgia. In those elections, voters, especially voters in some of Georgia's predominantly Black and lower income precincts, experienced a lot of voter suppression, including long lines, faulty machines at polling places. My sister told me how she waited in line for hours to vote. NC, can you talk to us a little bit about what happened during this primary election in Georgia and what needs to be done now to prevent this from happening again during the upcoming 2020 elections and in other states across the country?
Again, what we saw in Georgia was elected leaders and sort of enemies of democracy and enemies of progress take a sledgehammer to our elections infrastructure. What happened in Georgia was intentional, and it was completely avoidable, completely. There are no circumstances where people should have to wait for 6 hours in line to wait, none at all. What we saw was like what we saw in Kentucky and other places across the country. County boards of elections, secretaries of state, using a global pandemic as pretext for narrowing people's options and making it difficult for people to participate in our democracy. The end. There was all kinds of best practices and guidance. There's all kinds of white papers. This is how you should wipe down the machines. We should distance the machines 6 feet from each other. We should move polling locations from places where there are vulnerable populations. Georgia did none of that. None of that. LaTosha and her team can tell you about one of the last polling locations to close in South Atlanta, where it was a senior facility. It was like there are medically fragile people who were living there, and they still kept it as a polling location. People weren't observing physical distancing protocols. Georgia purchased 30,000 new voting machines. They are the most expensive machines that have been purchased in Georgia history, and quite frankly, turn out to be the least secure machines that Georgians have ever had the displeasure of voting on. How do you run out of paper? Like, you know that people are coming to vote. The Secretary of State admitted on the last day of early voting, that maybe 50,000 Georgians had not received their absentee ballot despite having requested one, and despite them being eligible to receive one, that they had not received their ballots by Election Day. We know that that number is easily twice that. So they were willing to publicly admit that 50,000 voters had not received their ballots. Again, our democracy is under attack. The end, full stop. And so when I think about what needs to happen in order to sort of prevent that from happening in November, I'll start by saying, one, you cannot fix what you have not faced. And what I mean by that is the sooner we dispense with the notion that like there are just some bad places and maybe it's just the Deep South and oh, it's just the Dixiecrats and it's just Georgia and it's just Kentucky. It is not just Georgia. It is not just Kentucky. They are laying out the blueprint for how they plan to make sure that they interfere with our elections and that they do everything to blunt the will of the people. And that is a problem. And we have to first acknowledge that that is happening. That is what you are seeing. With the administration or the RNC suing the state of California for mailing out absentee ballots to eligible voters. We saw this morning at 8 a.m. Legislators in the Georgia House introducing language that would make it illegal for counties or the Secretary of State to mail out absentee ballot applications to eligible voters proactively. It is because, quite frankly, Secretary of State Raffensperger mailed out absentee ballot applications to Georgians that we saw historic participation, that we saw historic turnout. That is the sign of a secure democracy, a mature democracy, where the will of the people can be reflected in the results of the elections, and that is what they don't want to happen. And so again, I say that first we must acknowledge that this is what is happening and that we have to stop it. Now, while we have to wait for elections in order to get new leaders, I think that there are a lot of things that people can do in this moment. Many of them have already been mentioned by my fellow panelists. But what I will add is that this is all of our responsibility. This is everybody's job. That if you're a healthcare voter, if you're an education voter, if you're a reproductive justice voter, right? If you are a safety voter, a criminal legal reform voter, that the idea that we are going to win on any issue that matters to any of us in any election, when we can't have elections where everybody who's eligible is able to register. Once they register, they're able to stay on the rolls and not be unjustly purged. And once they make it on the rolls, that they're able to vote without having to clear unnecessary hurdles. You know, I was heartened by the stories, right? Mothers waiting in line with their newborns in the pouring rain. It oscillated between being like oppressively hot and then torrential downpour all day on election day. You know, in Georgia, there is a law that says that if you're over the age of 75, between the hours of 9:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m., if you're 75 and older, you're allowed to walk to the front of the line. And we saw 72-year-olds being told to get back to the back of the line, them and their walkers, right? So I think that wherever you see attacks on voting rights, attacks on like the individual's right to vote, or them trying to do slick things to make it difficult or to suppress the vote, I think you have to use your voice. We have to stop it. So while the call is absolutely going to go out, I know Black Voters Matter is going to put out the call. I know Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is going to put out a call. I know that DC Votes is going to put out the call. The Leadership Conference for Election Day volunteers and election protection workers on Election Day. We have to acknowledge that many of the attacks are happening now. right? So the lawsuit against California happened a couple of weeks ago. The bill that was introduced in Georgia happened this morning, that they are preparing now to cheat, right? To interfere within our democracy. And we need to mobilize now. We need to raise our voices, and we need to act as if this is an urgent matter, because it is. I fully expect, what we haven't talked about is violence at the polls. And while there were some incidents, right, I definitely recall police being called on election protection workers, people just trying to hand out water and provide comfort to voters. With the end of the 1980 consent decree that bound the RNC's hands and forbid them from using their resources to, again, encourage violence at the polls. With that restriction being lifted, A, and then B, in the moment that we are in, I am very concerned about how to protect ourselves and to keep people safe when trying to exercise the franchise. So yes, like, we are going to push for vote by mail, but like everyone else has said, there's so much more that we have to do, and it has to start now.
Thank you so much, Insay, and thank you and your colleagues at NGP for the work that you're doing in the state of Georgia and the model that it represents for people in states all over the country. Next, we're going to turn to Bo Shuff of DC Vote. But before we do, I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't back up just a step and mention one link that was shared from Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. It's justiceforbrianna.org. And, we hear George Floyd's name all the time. Breonna's name is not mentioned enough. There has been little to no justice for her to date. Please check the chats, look into this link, and if you can help support the efforts to get justice for Breonna, please do. Next up, we're going to hear from Bo Shuff, who is the executive director of DC Vote, which fights for full and equal representation of all DC residents through DC statehood. He's a seasoned political and organizational strategist who served progressive candidates and causes for more than 15 years. This Friday, the House of Representatives is expected to pass a DC statehood bill. This has been a long, long time in coming. Bo, can you talk to us about why statehood is so critical to the residents of DC like myself?
Sure, absolutely. First, let me start. Alan, thank you so much for having us as part of this important panel. Belated thanks to Representative Kennedy, who's a co-sponsor of the bill, and to the rest of my panelists. I'm not even going to try to sing because nobody wants to hear that, so I'm already sort of one step behind, but empowered by the messages from the rest of the panel, and so excited to get involved. DC lives in a different status, and we have for 3 weeks shy of 230 years. July 16th of 1790, and we've been in a different status ever since then. And the status is such that if we fix all the election issues, we saw some of those here on our own primary day with lines around the building and absentee ballots that went missing or never arrived. Even if we fix all of those, we don't end up with anybody representing us. We call it the original form of voter suppression, because even if our voting systems were to work and even if the voices were completely counted, there's nobody there to listen once they arrive, because we have no U.S. senators, and our member of the House of Representatives, who is a delegate, not a full representative, has no vote. So this is super important, and we've seen it become even more important over the last 4 or so weeks as the president has decided to use the District of Columbia as his laboratory for authoritarianism, as the Atlantic just called it, and to invade city streets and residential neighborhoods with military forces, supersized law enforcement forces, and even military helicopters, which reached a height of 45 feet over our street to disperse protesters. These are things that can only happen in the District of Columbia because we don't have control over our own government and our own actions that can all be superseded by the federal government. So statehood is vitally important. It is anchored in racial injustice and racism. It has continued to exist because a majority Black and brown city is overseen by a majority white Congress, and there's not enough interest and enough power in changing that structure until hopefully this Friday when we will pass it through the House for the first time in history.
Thanks, Bo. As I posed the question to a few of our other guests tonight, can you talk a little bit about the work that you've done and how people here on this call can support that work and what's next after this House vote?
Yeah, it's actually really important that people on this call and people outside of the district take action and get involved. Unlike most of the repairs or the fixes that need to happen to democracy systems, those need to happen locally in many locations. We need to fix which systems are being used to register voters, which systems are being used to vote on, and which systems are being used to count the votes. As far as DC statehood, we don't have control over the ultimate outcome. That's up to the Congress, and we don't have votes in the Congress. So we need folks from Georgia and Kentucky and all over the country to help us speak to their members of Congress, both Democrat and Republican alike, speak to their United States senators, and really put pressure on that if you believe in a robust democracy, it includes everyone. We're the only nation's capital in the entire world where the people who live in the capital are not represented. We are the only people in the United States who have no direct line to the United States Senate. We have no say when it comes to important matters like confirmations to the judiciary, or we don't even have the ability to get sponsorship if our students want to attend academies. So it runs the gamut of influence, and it's really up to the people who live outside of DC to get involved. I think in the chat they've put our website where people can get involved and learn a lot more. It's showupfordc.com. It's the number 4. So showup4dc.com. It's got all kinds of information as well as actions people can take, graphics you can share, videos that you can watch, because this is an issue that a lot of people don't know much about in other places, and we're counting on the rest of America to help restore democracy for the nation's capital.
Thanks so much, Bo. Really appreciate that. And it looks like we're approaching the end of our time together, but before we leave, I'd love it if the panel could field a couple of questions from the live stream and registered participants in this panel. First up, we have a question from Francis. Francis asks, please address how voters can get last-minute help. For example, if they're out of state or disabled, and absentee ballots don't arrive on time, or boards of elections question their signatures and there isn't time to rectify, etc. Would any panelists like to field that?
I can go for Kentucky. Specifically, we actually have a phone number you can call for Kentucky voters. If you were unable to vote yesterday because of the long lines at the polling place, or if you had an issue receiving your absentee ballot, you can contact 866-687-8683, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And it's a protection line where we have people that can give you some information on getting your vote counted.
Thanks, Shirlisa.
Alan, will you repeat the question, please?
Of course. The question is, please address how voters can get last-minute help. For example, if they're out of state or disabled and absentee ballots don't arrive on time, or boards of elections question their signatures and there isn't time to rectify, etc.
Yeah, I mean, knowing the jurisdiction would be most helpful, but without that information, I'm going to absolutely say that 866 Our Vote is the phone number that we would encourage people to call. It's the election protection hotline that is staffed and run and has been for several cycles now. It's a combination of the Lawyers Committee and ACLU and the Leadership Conference and several organizations that are known and that are trusted in this space. And it's a national hotline. So they are responsible for training and recruiting lawyers in states all across the country to respond to last minute challenges that voters face. So yeah, 866 Our Vote for sure.
Thanks, Sensei. Our next question comes from Michelle. Michelle asks, when we vote by mail, that means we often don't have the results on election day. In 2018, it took over a week for every election to be called. If that's true of the presidential election, how do we keep people from thinking the vote is rigged if we are in limbo for days or weeks?
I mean, I can answer it short. You know, there's two things. There's a short term and it's a long term piece. I think one, the long term is structurally we can't. Like right now, we've got to fight for voter suppression. The bottom line is, you know, we're witnessing a all-out attack on voters, and particularly voters of color. And so it's really difficult for us. We've got to do two things. So one, I think that's why it's really important that part of what our work is really engaging people in the process so that we can start kind of tracking, building a relationship with voters and literally start tracking the process so that we can document as their problems arrive, right? And so we can start building a record. The second piece though, is that long-term, there's gonna have to be some fundamental structural change. It's almost like there's no way to fix. It's like you got a broken car and you're trying your best to make the broken car do something else. It won't go 100 miles an hour because it's not set up for that. It ain't designed to do that. So essentially what we need to do is a couple of things. One, we really need to be funding and supporting democracy work. And that is organizations like NSA, Shirlisa's and mine, and many other organizations. We need, and DC Votes, we need to support those organizations. Right now, democracy is literally being protected by folks like us, not our government, right? It really is. We just got to be honest, and so I think that it's important that we literally support. One of the things we can do in the long term is really support the building of those organizations that are really going to undergird this democracy movement that we have to have in this country. Secondly, is to really be pushing for these provisions. And then third, when we're talking about this election cycle, if we get, what we find out is we've got to decrease the chances of the voter suppression. And the way that you do that is early and often. Like we've got to get people engaged in the process most consistently so they'll know, and educated by the process in a way that they know their rights, when they know that something is happening. Secondly, when we're voting just on election day without these other elements, sometimes it's almost too late. Like yesterday in Louisville, we were the first voter we ran into was at the Urban League, who came with a letter. He got a letter from the Board of Elections saying that he had voted, that he was not registered as a Democrat and that he was not going to be allowed to vote that day. He said when he was in line, there were 11 other people. He said he had never voted Republican, so he had voted Democrat in the last election cycle, so he didn't know why he got that letter, and he received the letter on yesterday, right? And so the bottom line, there's all kinds of processes that's happening like that. If we get people to vote earlier, some of those things we can work out as they run into problems, like people know we can actually work through the process. So I think one of the ways we've got to do is document. We've got to start really working early and often, getting people engaged in the process really early, really getting people engaged in the habit of voting, but also making sure that they're connected to knowing where they can actually document that. And then we got to work on long-term, how we're going to structurally change this process, because the process fundamentally right now is rigged in a way that it makes us fight all over the places. All these access points, it's like we're putting out a million little fires.
Thanks, LaTosha. We have time for one more quick question, and this one involves the U.S. Postal Service. A number of viewers wrote in to ask how we can make sure that our mail systems will allow people to vote at home. What can we do to protect the mail system itself?
Well, I think that we can, I don't know, elect new people in Congress and get a new president. That feels like one way, an approach but here's the other thing. Despite the like negative rhetoric, I think that people rely heavily on the Postal Service. Like, it is a lie that it is an institution that is dying. It is also an institution that is under attack. And so, you know, from attacking the employees themselves and their retirement benefits to sort of the rhetoric around like them not being good at their job. Most of us rely, and most like institutions that we trust rely on the Postal Service. And so I wish that I had like a better, sexier answer, but I don't. We need new elected leaders who don't see it as their job to attack long-standing, critical institutions that like power America.
That works for me. Would anyone else like to weigh in before we wrap?
Let me just, not totally related to our issue, but if it's an issue that matters to you, make it an issue that matters to elected officials, which it does relate to statehood, because that's what we've done, is make it an issue that matters to elected officials. Don't take no for an answer. Don't tell them that it's okay. Use the post office yourself. Like, if you have means to go buy a pack of stamps and never use them, go for that. If you can't, I understand that as well. But make it a voting issue for the elected officials, and they will listen eventually. But it has to be sustained. It can't be the last question of the town hall. It has to be something that we continue, because it's right. Most of America relies on it, and it is a vital service to especially rural areas, especially to poor and underserved communities. The Postal Service has to be maintained, and it has to become an issue that we hold our electeds accountable.
I agree. I just want to add one thing, especially what you said, Bo, that where do you work where you beg the person that you hired to do some of the work that you hired them for? Like, where does that happen? Where do they do that at? My point is, on some level, when we're talking about elected officials, like, we're going to them as if they got power, and then we've got to convince them to represent us. If they don't represent us, move them out of office. They'll listen next time. At the end of the day, we're not holding consequences. We're trying to convince people to actually support our interests when their position is to serve and represent our issue. And so what we've got to do, I think part of that is this expansion around engagement. When we see more people engaged in the process, that's when things change. And so it's not a matter of, I think we've got to flip this thing around the way how we see democracy in this country. We got to flip around where who really is the boss. They're not the boss, and then we begging them or whatever. They're in that position for one purpose, that is to serve the interests of the citizenry. And so we've got to hold them accountable to that. And so it's really important that we also shift as voters, and as those of us that are doing this work, we've got to shift the narrative around who really is in charge.
Thank you for that, LaTosha. And with that, It looks like that's our time for tonight. I want to take a second to thank our amazing guests, Julia Macedo do Nascimento, Representative Joe Kennedy, Leigh Chapman from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, LaTosha Brown from Black Voters Matters Fund, Shirlisa Arnold from KFTC, Ufot from the New Georgia Project, and Shuff from DC Vote. I also want to take a second to thank my fantastic colleagues who help put this show together each and every week. Parker Breza, Laura Collins, Hiba Kassim, and Jessica Warren-Scruggs. And finally, I just want to thank each and every one of you watching this. At the end of the day, like LaTosha said, policy alone doesn't make the change. It's the people who have the power to make the change. And all of these discussions wouldn't really have much of a point without your support, passion, and fire. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, and have a great evening.